We are going to continue our series called The Sanctuary Under Investigation. Today it is in favour of the saints. A few weeks ago we presented the topic of, we asked the question, is the judgment biblical? And really we were asking, is a pre-Advent investigative judgment biblical? And we explored that, and if you want to go back and check that out, or hopefully that message is on YouTube that you can check that out. But we want to ask the question, when did the investigative judgment begin in heaven? As Seventh-day Adventists, we believe that in 1844, Jesus began the ministry of the typical Day of Atonement, a cleansing of the sanctuary in a time of judgment. But when does that happen? A few weeks ago when we explored the subject of the judgment, we discovered from the Bible that there is a judgment that takes place after the time of Paul, but before the second coming of Jesus. But can we get closer than that? And we're going to look at when in heaven did the judgment begin. And to do that, we're going to take a look at a particular prophecy, and it's Daniel chapter 7. But in order to appreciate Daniel chapter 7, I just wanted to draw our attention for a moment to Daniel chapter 2. We are not going to explore this at length today. We don't have time, although hopefully nobody's planning on going anywhere for a while. But today, as you go out the door, there's a little tract called An Ancient Prophecy Reveals the Future. That's about Daniel chapter 2. And on the little sharing table to the left, you will also find this little book, The History of Tomorrow. Some Things Never Change, and these are both about Daniel chapter 2. If you are not familiar with the subject of Daniel chapter 2, that's going to be important for background to what we're going to discuss today. So in Daniel chapter 2, you may remember King of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, 600 BC, he has a dream of this image, and he doesn't know what it means, and he can't remember it, and he calls in his wise men, and Daniel comes and interprets it for him and tells him that Babylon is the head of gold. That will be followed by another kingdom, the Persians. That will be followed by the belly and thighs of bronze, which will be Greece, which would be followed by the legs of iron, which represented Rome. Then the kingdom would be divided. And then finally, God's kingdom would come and all the other kingdoms would disappear. And we are still in that prophecy, aren't we? The kingdoms are still divided, but God's kingdom has not yet come. That will be the return of Jesus. So we're still in the toes of that image, and we are still awaiting God's kingdom to come in glory. We're going to now turn to Daniel chapter 7, and I'd like for you to take your Bible if you have it. We're going to read through Daniel chapter 7. And take a look at ultimately the judgment and when does it take place and can we know. So in Daniel chapter 7 you have 4 beasts, and let's read from Daniel chapter 7. We're going to read from verse 1. It says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. Then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And 4 great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. So he has this vision. The wind is blowing, the sea is disturbed, and out of the sea come these 4 beasts. 4 great beasts, it says. Now we're going to drop down to verse 17 because we want to understand who these beasts are even before we start to read about them. Verse 17 of Daniel 7, it says, those great beasts which are 4 kings which arise out of the earth. So these 4 beasts represent 4 kings or 4 kingdoms that arise out of the earth, and we're going to identify them in a moment. Drop down to verse 23. A little later in the interpretation it says, thus he said, the 4th beast shall be a 4th kingdom on the earth which shall be different from all other kingdoms. So here these four beasts simply represent kingdoms, nations, political powers. That's what they represent. And we can understand this. This should not be too difficult for us to understand because, as I've mentioned before, you can think about the way in which we still use animals or beasts to represent nations. So if the Wallabies were playing the Springboks, that would mean that Australia was playing South Africa. You're thinking of it tonight, it might be this afternoon, I don't know, I won't be watching the game, but apparently the British and Irish Lions are playing Australia today in rugby. And the British and Irish Lions are playing the Australian Wallabies. We still use animals to represent different nations and kingdoms, right? So this is simply what the Bible is doing. There are four kingdoms represented here: a lion, a bear, a leopard, and a terrible beast. And we want to identify them. So let's take a look at the lion. We're going to pick it up in Daniel chapter 7, verse 4. It says, "The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings." Ever seen one of those? No. Lions don't typically have eagle's wings. These are not real creatures. They're representing something else. First was a lion had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. Who is this beast? The Bible is its own interpreter. In the book of Jeremiah, chapter 4 and verse 7, Jeremiah is foreshadowing the coming of Babylon to overthrow the kingdom of Judah. And he says, "The lion has come up from his thicket, and the destroyer of nations is on his way. He has gone forth from his place to make your land desolate. Your cities will be laid waste without inhabitant." Jeremiah is describing here Babylon as a lion. It has wings because in the Bible, wings represent swiftness. You ever said to somebody, "I'm in a hurry, I've got to fly"? Wings represent swiftness in the Bible. And so the lion represents Babylon. And in fact, outside the ancient city of Babylon, there was a statue, a black statue of a lion mauling one of its enemies. And it's called the Lion of Babylon. Furthermore, you don't have to believe me. Any Rolling Stones fans in the house? Probably not. The Rolling Stones put out an album in 1997 called Bridges to Babylon. And on the cover they had a lion with a Babylonian beard standing on 2 feet like a man. Apparently they know who Babylon is. Or, particularly, they know who the lion represents. And you'll notice this lion has had its wings clipped off too. You have the album cover on the left there, and on the right-hand side is the DVD of the tour that they did to promote that album. So the Rolling Stones know who Babylon is, and they know it's the lion. If you went to the Berlin Museum, you'd see a lot of tiles there that were recovered from the ruins of Babylon, and they've put them on the walls, and you have a whole procession of lions, and if you look at them very closely, you'll notice that it's a lion with wings. There is no doubt that the lion with wings represents the kingdom of Babylon. And so if we look at Daniel chapter 2, and we notice that the head of gold in Daniel chapter 2 represented Babylon, well, the lion in Daniel chapter 7 also represents Babylon. But Daniel chapter 7 continues, and it describes this bear. Take a look with me at where are we? Verse 5. "And suddenly another beast, a second like a bear, it was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, Arise, devour much flesh." This bear represents the next kingdom that would come after Babylon. In fact, the kingdom that would overthrow Babylon. And that was the Medes and the Persians. And the Medes and the Persians were a coalition power. And it was raised up on one side because the Persians eventually became greater than the Medes. Lots of people have probably never heard of the Medes, but they've heard of the Persians because they have Persian cats, Persian rugs, and the Persian Gulf. I have a copy of the wall chart of world history, and it's basically a replica of Archbishop Ussher's chronology that he did of the Bible back in 1650. And in that, you've got a picture of the lion there. It says Daniel's first vision, a lion with eagle's wings, Babylon rapid and strong in the conquest of Syria, Phoenicia, Judah, and Egypt. And then next to that, you've got the second beast, a bear with 3 ribs in its mouth. That is Medo-Persia, with Babylon, Egypt, and Lydia, whom it conquered. The point being that this is very old interpretation. This is not something I cooked up this week. This is not my idea of who I think the bear might be, but clearly Ussher understood who the bear was back in the 1600s. And so we put that on our chart, that Persia is represented in Daniel 7 by the bear. But the Bible continues in verse 6 of chapter 7. After this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Here we have a leopard, which is a fast animal. It can run pretty quick. It also has wings, but it has 4 wings. Babylon had 2 wings. This creature has 4 wings, which we mentioned before, the wings represented speed. So this would represent a nation or a kingdom that was going to conquer with speed. Because A, it's a leopard, and they're pretty quick anyway. And then it's got 4 wings, which represent the swiftness with which it will conquer. It also has 4 heads, and this represents the kingdom of Greece, which rapidly conquered the territory around it, so that you have, in 12 short years, Alexander the Great conquers all the territory south of Macedonia all the way through to Egypt, and then he goes east and he conquers all the territory to the river of India. In 12 years. Then he comes back and he dies in the city of Babylon. And when he died, he was replaced by 4 generals: Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. And that's why this beast has 4 heads, because after Alexander, there will be 4 rulers of the different territories. So we can put Greece in to our little chart here. But the Bible continues, verse 7 and 8 of chapter 7 of Daniel. It says, After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. This 4th beast is so dreadful and terrible that Daniel can't think of an animal to describe it as. You've got the lion, the bear, and the leopard, but this one is just dreadful and terrible. And so artists have tried to be creative about portraying what it might have looked like. It says it had 10 horns, and then another little horn came up amongst them. Now, so far we've got these 4 beasts. This represents, by the way, it had huge iron teeth. If we go to Daniel 2, we notice that the legs represented the empire of Rome. They were made of iron. And so this 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, that comes after Greece, represents the Roman Empire. Those are those 4 beasts, that the 4 kingdoms that they represent: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Now, as I said before, the interpretation I'm sharing with you now is centuries old. Protestants for centuries have understood these four beasts. In fact, if you go to the old town hall in Nuremberg, Germany, you go to the old town hall there, and above the doors they have some carvings. And you will notice here above one door you have a lion with wings with a figure that's supposed to represent a Babylonian. Then you have here a bear that's got 3 ribs in its mouth that's supposed to represent the Medes and the Persians. Over another doorway you have a 4-headed leopard with somebody who looks a bit like Alexander the Great. And then on the other side you have this terrible beast with the horns, and you have this Roman figure. So my point is, not only has this been well known and well documented, it's carved in stone. So this is very well understood in the Protestant world. So let's talk a little bit about the 10 horns. I want to drop down to the 10 horns for a moment. Look at verse 24 for a minute. We're going to read the whole thing anyway, but I want you to skip ahead to 24. Verse 24 of Daniel 7. It says, "The 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom." If you think about the fourth beast being Rome, from that kingdom these 10 horns would arise. And indeed, when the Roman Empire fell, nations emerged from the Roman Empire. Nations that we think about today, some of the nations of Western Europe, emerged from the Roman Empire when the Rome fell. And then, interestingly enough, if you have, as it says in verse 24, the 10 horns are 10 kings or kingdoms that arise from this kingdom. If you have a little horn, what would that represent? Well, if 10 horns represent 10 kingdoms, a little horn would represent a little kingdom. Does that make sense? Represents a little kingdom. And you have the rise of this little horn power. And of course, Protestants over the last 500 years have identified this power as the papal power. And again, this is not a mystery, this is not something new. It's simply that we, in the Western world and in the modern world, we have forgotten many of the things that were known centuries ago. And so the 10 horns represent the nations that arose after the fall of the Roman Empire, and the little horn represented the papal power that arose just after those 10 horns. And we'll talk about that in a moment. I want to talk about, let's go back to the vision in Daniel 7. We'll pick it up now in verse 9. Because there's a change of scene. In verse 9 it says, "I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was as white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a flaming fire, a fiery flame, and its wheels a burning fire." This is a heavenly vision that Daniel is now having. He's been talking about these beasts representing the kingdoms of the earth, but now his focus shifts. And I don't know if you have it in your Bible, but in my Bible it goes from the narrative, and then it's set out in poetry, this section, because there's a change of scene from the earthly focus to the heavenly focus. And there is a vision of thrones being put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. I have to pause here. If thrones are put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated, it means he wasn't there before. Right? That there's a change in even his and the throne's position. Thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat, was seated. Something is happening in heaven at this time. Verse 10, "A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him, and the books were opened. And the court was seated, and the books were opened. So a new scene appears. It's a heavenly scene. A throne is set in place. The Ancient of Days, that we understand is God the Father, took his seat. And thousands upon thousands are there ministering to him and witnessing this event. So in verse 11, the focus switches again back to earthly things. It says, "Then I watched because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. I watched till the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. As for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time." And then it switches back to heaven. You ever watched a TV show and there are flashbacks? You ever watch a TV show and there's a change of scene? You know, you've got a scene in the house and then there's somebody in the desert or whatever it may be. There's a change of scene, and that's what's happening here. There's a change of scene. And you come to verse 13, and it says, "I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven." Now Daniel is having this vision and recording it in the 500s BC. And he uses this phrase, "one like the Son of Man." But when Jesus came to this earth 2,000 years ago, some 500 years after Daniel's prophecy, when Jesus comes to this earth, the phrase he uses about himself more than any other phrase is the Son of Man. Jesus is identifying himself with this character in Daniel chapter 7. Because Daniel 7 is written 500 years before Jesus comes. But Jesus is saying, the Son of Man, the Son of Man, the Son of Man. He uses that phrase about himself more than any other. And he's identifying himself with this character. So verse 13, "I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the earth? No, to the Ancient of Days." So you have this picture of the Son of Man coming to the Ancient of Days, who's now seated on this throne. "And they brought him near before him." Verse 14, "Then to him," that's to the Son of Man, "was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one which shall not be destroyed." Jesus is coming and he is receiving a kingdom. And it seems like that's the end of, that's the end of the thing, right? Because at that point he receives the kingdom and all the nations are going to worship him. And you have all of those other kingdoms which ultimately have come to an end, which we've read about. So that is the vision that Daniel sees. And in regards to the little horn power, we notice that there are 10 identifying characteristics of this little horn power in the chapter. When I first heard about the little horn power being identified as the papacy, I thought, that can't be true. I mean, I'm not a religious person. I don't care about the papacy or any other church, but I wouldn't go as far as to say that he was, this power. But then when you look at all of the identifying characteristics, it becomes obvious. Between Daniel 7 and Revelation 13, there are at least a dozen identifying characteristics. There are 10 in Daniel alone that identify this power. And ultimately, this power is going to make a war against the saints, it says. Let's read from verse 15 for a moment. Verse 15 of Daniel 7. It says, "I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit." He's just seen this vision. "I was grieved in my spirit within my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. I came near to one of those who stood by and asked him the truth of all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things." Now you're going to get the whole interpretation in 2 verses, 17 and 18. It's a very brief description. 17. Those great beasts which are four kings which arise of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and even forever and ever. That's it. That's the description of the whole vision. Are you satisfied with that? Daniel wasn't. Daniel said, I'd like to know more. So look at verse 19. Then I wished to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron, its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with his feet. And the 10 horns that were on his head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favour of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. True or false, the activity of this little horn in making war with the saints is carrying on until the Ancient of Days comes and a judgment is made. Can you see that the activity of the little horn precedes the judgment? Does that make sense? In other words, the little horn is active, making war with the saints, prevailing until the Ancient of Days comes and a judgment is made, and ultimately the kingdom is going to be given to the saints. Let's pick it up in verse 23. The angel, we believe it's an angel who's going to give this interpretation. He continues. He says, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it and break it in pieces. The 10 horns are 10 kings which shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall rise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. This little horn power has a period of time where he is ruling and reigning and continuing this activity. Verse 26, but the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and destroy it forever. Then the kingdom and the dominion, the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven, shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. That's the explanation. Daniel says, this is the end of the account. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me, and my countenance changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. Daniel receives this, and you would too. If you had a vision and you knew that at some point in the future, God's people are going to be persecuted, there's going to be a war against the saints, and it's going to go on for a period of time. And it said there, a time, times and a half a time. And then it says, but the court shall be seated. So in other words, the court is seated after this time, times and a half a time period of papal supremacy. What does the time, times and a half a time mean? Well, in the Bible, you may recall in Daniel chapter 4, when Nebuchadnezzar went mad and he went out of the kingdom for 7 years and lived as a wild man. The Bible says 7 times passed over him. And we understand that to mean 7 years he was out there in the wilderness until he realised that God was God. And so a time represents a year, times represents 2 years, and a half a time represents half a year. And so a time, times and a half a time would be a year, 2 years and a half a year. Biblically, a year was 12 months of 30 days. And so that would add up to 1,260 days. Interestingly enough, you find this time period in Daniel and the Revelation, but nowhere else. In Daniel it's twice, and in Revelation it's 5 times. 7 times you find this time prophecy, written different ways. It's written as a time, times and a half a time, or 1260 days, or sometimes it's written as 42 months. But it's all the same time period, and it represents that time of papal supremacy. Not 1,260 days, but actually 1,260 years. Now, how do we know that that's the way we should apply this interpretation? In other words, why isn't it 1,260 days? Well, first of all, if we've looked at the prophecy, we know that this little horn emerges and is active after the fall of the Roman Empire, and it's active for centuries. So it cannot be 1,260 days only. In fact, Jesus is the key to the day-year prophecy, or the day-year principle. And when we look at Daniel chapter 9 and the 70 weeks, which we will do in a couple of weeks' time, we will understand that Jesus is the key to the day-year principle. Because without it, Daniel 9 makes no sense. And with it, we identify Jesus as the Messiah. So this is 1,260 years that this papal power would be active. Ezekiel 4:6 says, I have laid on you a day for each year. In Numbers, it says, according to the number of days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, for each day you shall bear your guilt 1 year, namely 40 years. In other words, the Bible itself has used this day-year principle in other places. And that represented the time of papal supremacy from 538 AD to 1798, when Napoleon sent his general Berthier into Rome to arrest the Pope, and the Pope ended up dying in captivity. The Protestant Church in Europe and in America saw this as a sign of the fulfillment of this prophecy. When the Pope was taken captive, it dealt a deadly wound to that power. And Protestants in Europe and Protestants in North America and other places began to study the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation like never before. Before the year 1798, you could look around for books published on Daniel and Revelation, and there were very, very few of them. After 1798, there are a plethora of books being published on the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation, because they understood this to be a key moment when prophecy had been fulfilled. And we note it. I want to read verse 25 and 26 again of Daniel 7. Talking about the little horn, it says, he shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. But the court shall be seated, and they will take away his dominion to consume and destroy it forever. Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve him. In other words, you have the 1260-year prophecy, and then the court was seated. So what I'm saying to you is the judgment in heaven must occur after 1798. Because you have the activity of the little horn, and then you have the court is seated. And so whilst Daniel 7 doesn't pinpoint the date, and we will look at this more next week when we look at Daniel chapter 8, what it does tell us, as we looked at the investigative judgment a few weeks ago, we noted that there is a judgment. It takes place after the time of Paul, because Paul says God has appointed a day on which he will judge the world. But it is before the second coming, because Jesus says, I come quickly and my reward is with me. Here we can see that this judgment scene takes place after the 1,260-day prophecy, which means it takes place after 1798. Daniel 12, which we won't go into now, indicates that the time of the end began in 1798, at the end of this times and a half of time. The point being, we can now look at our chart in comparison to Daniel chapter 2, and we see that at the fall of Rome you now have more details. Daniel 2 gives us the broad outline. But in Daniel 7, what you have is a repeat and an enlargement of that prophecy, giving more finer detail. You have these beasts, which by the way are unclean beasts. Remember that for next week, because we're going to talk about that. Unclean beasts representing the nations. Next week, the nations are going to be represented by clean beasts. There's a reason for that too. But we note here, you've got Babylon, Persia, Greece and Rome, but then you have the rise of the little horn power and the persecution of the saints. And after that you have the judgment, and at the end of the judgment the kingdom will be given to the saints of the Most High. That is good news. Given that, if we believe that the judgment has been carrying on since, we believe 1844, but certainly after 1798, the next event to occur will be Jesus returning to give us the kingdom. And probably what we can learn from this chapter is that there is a judgment. It is after 1798, but it is before the end. So we're getting a little closer to when did the judgment take place in heaven? Why is this important? It gives us great confidence that God knows what He's doing. He hasn't gone away on holiday. God is actively working for you and I, interceding for you and I, atoning for you and I, advocating for you and I in the heavenly sanctuary. I want to finish once again with verse 22. Or maybe verse 21 and 22. It says, I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favour of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. Time is moving on. Every Sabbath we move a week closer to the second coming of Jesus. Jesus is in heaven pleading His merits on your behalf. The time to give your heart to Jesus is now. The time to send your sins to Jesus to be forgiven is now. Because the judgment is taking place. It has been taking place for such a long time now. And it is soon to close, and Jesus is soon to return in glory. We can have great confidence that Jesus will return because everything has taken place just as God prophesied it would. And the good news is that in the heavenly judgment, Jesus is our advocate, Jesus is our judge, and He's making decisions in favour of the saints. Do you want to be amongst that people? I do. Praise God that Jesus is our judge, our king, our sacrifice, and our soon to come deliverer. God bless you.